tools and how to make sense of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Let me know what I'm meant to do. Oh, here we go. Amazing, super. We've got a laser that works as well. Amazing. So yeah, really nice to be here today, and thank you so much. I'm a lecturer in nutrition at UCL, and so my area of interest is actually the other end of the spectrum, so things like malnutrition, cachexia in particular, but also sarcopenia and sarcopenic obesity. And I have a study with Dr. Janine Macronides here, so we're looking at things such as muscle wasting in patients after bariatric surgery and with GLP-1 agonists. So the idea today is to give a whistle-stop tour in 12 minutes. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I'll give it my best shot. And try and explain to you why body composition is so important to measure, okay? So this is something I teach my students. We have dietetic students, obesity and clinical nutrition students at UCL, nutrition medical science students, and this is a really important area of study, okay? So hopefully today I'll explain to you why. So as a lecturer, so this, for me, this is a really big thing, and also just in the world in general, is I see that there's a huge focus on body weight, okay? And weight loss. And I think there's a bit of a problem with that, okay? So for example, okay, we can take these 5 guys here, all got exactly the same body weight, okay, of 70 kilograms, different height, different waist circumference, different skeletal muscle mass, and so obviously they're going to have different BMIs, okay? And it's only this chap here who has an obese BMI. But for example, we take these guys, completely normal body mass index values, 24.2, but very different waist circumference and skeletal muscle mass. And we know that probably this person who may be physically inactive is going to be at much higher risk of cardiometabolic disease, for example. And so this is the whole point, is we should be looking at not just body weight. We need to consider what the body's made up of, okay? And so we have different ways of assessing for body composition. And there's a traditional 2-compartment composition model, is where we break the body into fat mass, body fat, and everything that isn't body fat, so fat-free mass, which includes all protein-containing tissue, such as all of your organs and your skeletal muscle mass. And just to note, because we're going to talk a lot about skeletal muscle mass in the next 10 minutes, is that that's the organ that is principally required for physical function. I feel like I'm going to tell all my students off. I feel like I'm going to be back in a lecture. So yeah. Thanks very much.
Silence for the speaker. Thank you.
Cheers, appreciate it. So, and it is like being back in a lecture, people's phones are going as well. So anyway, I'm only joking. So, so this is actually a really important organ that we should be measuring. It's a very important metabolic organ, but also important for physical function. But not every technique is the same. So when you look at just really basic techniques here, like BMI, for example, it's just an indication only. We can look at more complicated, more expensive gold standard techniques, such as scanning and imaging techniques, which are really useful. But at the same time, we might also want to consider techniques that are much more practical and portable that you can use in a clinic. There are other techniques as well. I mean, I don't have time to talk about it today, but there's certain biochemical and isotopic techniques for measuring body composition. But they all vary very significantly in terms of cost, accuracy, portability, and practicality. Another key consideration with all this, that some of you may or may not be aware, is there's a key consideration is the idea that our fat-free mass compartment is a constant of around 73%, and that's not truly accurate in all situations, for example, in disease states. But isotopic techniques and BIA in particular take that into consideration. And so if you look at in normal conditions, there's a relationship in mammals and humans that the fat-free mass compartment is made of 73% water, okay? Now, this is always a bit of fun. I always present this in my lectures because typically when we just judge sumo wrestlers over in Japan, these guys are extremely large athletes, but are they just obese, okay, and with a high fat mass? So back in 1994, some researchers did densitometry techniques, underwater weighing, and also things like ultrasound to assess them. And it's very interesting because they had literally the highest recorded fat-free mass ever recorded in history, which is interesting. And so if you look here, this is body mass here and fat-free mass, compared to bodybuilders and untrained, these guys have extremely high fat-free mass compartment, okay? So you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, that's the first thing to say. And another critically important point, this is definitely in the malnutrition world, and starting to filter into the obesity world, is that maybe we should be comparing, instead of BMI, we should be looking at things like fat-free mass index values and fat mass index values comparing to normative reference values. So one example of a study, this is who I usually quote, it's a group over in Switzerland when I look at malnutrition risk type studies. They did a bioelectrical impedance technique and validated this with DEXA, which is a reference technique for looking at fat-free mass and fat mass index, and the idea is you have centiles then for a normal population group. And the idea is, again, I'm just trying to highlight some techniques. So BIA, this is the body stat technique, so there's different ways of doing this. They vary in accuracy, very important point, but it's a portable technique, but it needs to be validated using a reference technique like DEXA, where you can measure things like fat-free mass and appendicular skeletal muscle in the limbs. And interestingly, just comparing, just for fun, if you look at the 95th percentile, okay, for fat-free mass and fat mass index, the sumo wrestlers is 26.4 kilogram per meter squared, which is far over in that direction. Now, the fat mass index was higher, so again, comparing to these guys here, yes, it's in the high range, but not the same as the fat-free mass index. So this is the first important point, is we should be assessing not just body weight, we should be looking at lean tissue and fat tissue independently. Key point now also to say, and this is the reason why also I've become more involved in this type of work, is because of things like GLP-1 agonists. And so we know, for example, that things like bariatric surgery and GLP-1 agonists in particular might actually lead to greater losses of lean mass, right? Important point. However, this is only part of the story and part of the picture, because in reality, you have to remember that skeletal muscle mass is one component of fat-free mass. And for example, it could be there's alterations in organ tissue mass relative to skeletal muscle mass. The thing I want to get across today is this tissue is absolutely crucial for metabolic and physical function. And you might have patients, for example, at baseline who could be potentially at risk of sarcopenia and frailty because of the effects of aging and disease and because of physical inactivity, okay? So this needs to be considered. Just going back to our sumo wrestlers and to highlight an interesting portable study is that you could use, for example, ultrasound techniques, which is a portable, practical technique you can use at bedside, not so affected by hydration. So, for example, in recent research in intensive care unit departments, they've been using, for example, ultrasound to measure, for example, rectus femoris muscle in the quadricep and look at changes with muscle loss with, for example, in ICU. Now, interestingly, going back to our sumo wrestlers, you can see here, there's a nice, looks like a linear correlation, but as we get to higher levels of fat-free mass, and these are really high levels, is that doesn't seem to appear anymore, which is interesting. What does that mean? Maybe it's because there's hypertrophy of other organs, okay, rather than skeletal muscle. Could I ask a favour, just very kindly? Guys, yeah, thank you so much, appreciate it. So, and so the other thing to note here is when we think of things such as what this term sarcopenia, the original definition of sarcopenia was a loss of skeletal muscle mass in aging, and that definition changed dramatically over time. It is based upon research from data from a population group in New Mexico, where they used DEXA scans and specifically looked at lower levels of skeletal muscle mass in the limbs, appendicular skeletal muscle index. The reason for that is because obviously in the limbs that more closely relates to physical function and has greater importance for frailty risk. And the reason I mention this is because if you look at a whole range of studies, this was going back to 2012, systematic review, a meta-analysis paper, low muscle mass, and in particular, very importantly, low muscle strength, dynapenia, actually closely correlates with disability, okay, and poor physical function. And so actually, there's two key points here. Is first of all, we should be measuring this, but maybe that could actually be more important in terms of disability risk. And going forward, just to expose another technique, and coming in here today, I saw the mobile MRI unit out in the front in the car park. I'm not suggesting we could all get MRI scans and look at fat infiltration on the way out. But MRIs are very good because obviously you can measure visceral fat, for example, but you also can measure intermuscular fat. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. For example, muscle, it can look like very marbled. With physical inactivity with disease, we know, for example, you get this intermuscular fat accumulation, and that correlates very well with poor metabolic function, insulin resistance, and poor physical function. Just one example, this is a group actually in King's College, Peter Emery and a team. So the idea is, for example, you could look at this, you could use MRI, and you can compare, for example, estimation of muscle quality and physical function. And this is the measurement of edema, this is the measurement of fat fraction within muscle, and just look at the differences with different age ranges, and it strongly correlates. This is knee extension power. And other studies have shown the same, that muscle quality, so the muscle mass can be the same size, but quality affects physical function. So another key point to this whole thing is, for example, in a clinic, rather than just looking at basic techniques, you should use really simple practical measures of physical function and muscle strength, like hand grip strength test and sit-to-stand testing, because of the higher potential risk for sarcopenia and frailty. So in a few minutes, hopefully I've tried to get across that first of all, and I haven't been able to do this in detail, but first of all is that the body composition assessment is critical. In particular, looking at the skeletal muscle compartment is very important because it correlates very highly with sarcopenia and frailty risk and disability risk. And so if you have patients, most importantly, where there's rapid loss of lean tissue, for example, it could be the effects of bariatric surgery with GLP-1 agonists, this has to be looked at carefully. On an interesting note, if you're interested in the research, just for, again, for fun, is that although this exists, there is other research showing that with GLP-1 agonists, that there's actually a potential improvement in muscle quality, and there's a few studies we looked at MRI. So that's another important point, is again, you can't judge a book by its cover. There's many aspects to consider. However, I suggest that we shouldn't just be looking at body weight alone, okay, as a key outcome. But there we go. Cheers. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much. We'll have questions a little bit later